Thank you, Stephen. How's everyone doing? Fantastic. We're all doing great. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And as you'll see, this story that I'm about to tell you certainly relates to what you're here for. I think it really is to understand the modern dilemmas that we have in terms of our food systems and how those food systems, from the soil all the way up, impact everything that we do, the way we live our lives, and certainly the health that we carry forward, hopefully every day. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to Steve and everyone who's done such a great job in organizing everything here. So I'll put my cup out of the way here. Great. And we'll make sure everything is on. So I'd like to tell you a story this morning, a story that unfolds as so many of the best movements in the world do, movements that start with individuals, that build into communities, and then that begin to move forward and take hold and take root and spread beyond those individuals and beyond those communities into what we all hope is a new paradigm for moving forward and trying to find our way, in this case, to a pesticide-free future. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about this story and dig into it, there's the book, A Precautionary Tale, that's also available through Audible. And then there's also this website, which you'll learn more about here as we go along, called Toppling Goliath. And toppling.org is, there we have the website where we've documented the story of Maltz, and Maltz is the town that we'll be talking about, M-A-L-S, and Malles is the Italian name, M-A-L-L-E-S, and we'll tell you a little more about those origins as we go along. But topplinggoliath.org will give you some of the chronology of how this story unfolded. And really, when we chose this name, Toppling Goliath, and working with my colleague Douglas Gayton, it is because that's so much of the part of what it is that we're doing now as we move forward. It is about toppling the Goliaths of our age, and Goliaths that never necessarily deserve to be where they are. It really is in so many ways important for the Davids of the food system to step forward, and maybe not cast stones, but at least take care of business and advance things forward as we go along. So hope you'll take a chance to check that out, where you can see some of the images that I'm about to show you. You can see those online, and I think you'll really enjoy going back and reflecting on those. So I just want to recognize that, as any good story is, it really is a mosaic of personalities and people and expertise of different folks who work together with me on telling this story. And here you have Douglas Gayton. Douglas and his wife Laura are the co-founders of the Lexicon of Sustainability. Really encourage you, if you're interested, to check out the work that they've been doing on the lexicon.org. And Douglas and Laura started this nonprofit organization in an effort to figure out ways to tell the stories of what's going on in our food systems and to tell those in intriguing ways, which I hope is what you find to be the case here. So that you've probably seen some of their short films on PBS and other places, as you may recognize them as you go along. And now they're also working on the plant-forward diet and other topics with some of the organizations that they're working on. So I think you'll enjoy checking out what they're doing. And then Mickey de Rakowitz is the young man that you see to the right here. And Mickey is someone, as I'll tell you the story, someone I've known literally since he was 6 months old. And he was the interpreter for a lot of the scenarios that we encountered as we went along the ways, and also the person who sort of did the ground testing in terms of culture as we went along. And then Pier Giorgio Provenzano, who's a wonderful filmmaker, as I did this film.org. And he is based in England. He's Italian by birth and was just a wonderful compatriot in trying to capture this story. And, in working with Douglas, there's a couple of things that I learned that I'd like to share with you, because we're at the point now, as I mentioned with Toppling Goliath, that we have to figure out ways in which really to take on an industry or industries that have dominated in so many ways and have really, unfortunately, they've become the mainstream, at least in their own minds, and certainly in the flow of economic dollars. And one of the things that I think it's critical to think about is the fact that, unfortunately, in some ways, when you look at our food system, we have yet really to sort of crack this nut of the food system. we're still at the point where we barely reached 5% by almost any measure in terms of how we look at health and wellness. When we look at organic sales, and when we look at certainly the acreage that is maintained for organic production, when we basically look at the things that I think people who are attending this conference, are so wedded to, we haven't hit the 5% threshold in terms of the amount of money spent in our food system. We back? Okay. And so that's something that I'd like you to think about. On the other hand, when we look at organic, that is the fastest growing trend. So there is good news in these smaller numbers, but I think we have to find ways to tell the stories and also to interpret the science and really put that forward to the public in some new kinds of ways. And so I think that really is part of the genius that Douglas has really utilized over the last couple of decades in trying to tell these stories. So there's one piece that I think is really important that Douglas passed on to me. We think about food waste. Certainly that's part and parcel of what people are thinking about here. But he also talks about information waste and the fact that if we were going to travel this far, for several of us to go 6,000, 9,000 miles several times in order to try to capture this story, then there could be no information waste. So we had to grab the story in as many ways as we could. We had to do it by audio interviews, video interviews. Obviously we were doing things through writing. And then the other thing that Douglas talks about that I think is really important in these kinds of movements that we're trying to push forward is not just about information waste, but it's also about being platform agnostic. If we want to tell these stories and we want to get them out there, we have to do that in as many ways as possible. And in many ways, I think the Real Truth About Health Conference exemplifies that, because if we're going to hit as many audiences as we can, we need to do it through books. We need to do it through audio. We need to do it through video. We need to do it as we've done here, with pop-up shows, literally taking them to the streets in some cases, for example, in front of the San Francisco ferry terminal, where the farmers market was there. We have to reach people of all populations, all persuasions, in order to really magnify this movement. And that's been a really important lesson for me in working with Douglas. So this is me. I had more hair, more muscle, less of other things. This is back in the 1990s. This is me harvesting grapes at a place that has been really a second home for me for many years, since 1983. We were harvesting grapes here at Brunenberg Castle. This is a place where I went when I was a college student back in 1983. And just fell in love with the whole South Tyrolean landscape. And the castle had not only a working vineyard, but then also had an agricultural museum. And I was just smitten from the very first time that I saw this culture and encountered it. It just totally blew me away. So part of what I wanted to do was go back as much as I could, and it ended up that in 1990 I went back what turned out to be a 3-year stint as the farm helper there, and part of my job was to help manage the vineyard. Unfortunately, the farmer, when I got there, he died after I was there for about 6 months of a heart attack, and so I ended up taking over more of the farm than I ever intended, and sort of an odd thing for an American to do in the Tyrolean Alps, but started to take over the day-to-day management, and part of that involved spraying pesticides. And the spraying of pesticides in any of these perennial crops, particularly fruits, it's something that often seems to go hand in hand. Obviously, I'm going to argue that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. But part of what I did, and I was really the only one in the village that I ever saw wearing a respirator when I was spraying pesticides. I also wore a rubber suit, rubber pants, and it usually involved getting up well before sunlight, being ready to go as soon as there was enough light, going out in the respirator and in the rubber suit, going out and spending usually 6, 7, 8 hours spraying until it was done, because once you started, you just had to get it all done. And, I kept saying to my boss, just can't we be organic? And again, this is back in the early 1990s. And my boss, whose name was Sito, he said, we'd love to go organic. He said, I don't like spending the money on the pesticides, and certainly I recognize that they're not all going to be safe. We did try to keep them at a kind of a minimum in terms of toxicity. A lot of what we were spraying was sulfur and copper, and that's something that has a little bit of a history that I'll tell you about. But there were also a few other things we sprayed. But Sito, my boss, challenged me. He said, so go out and find an organic vineyard, that's working, and figure out how they're doing it, and then come back and we can talk about it. And again, early 1990s, I went out and I tried to find that vineyard, and I could not find the vineyard where it was working economically. Oops, no, looks like I lost you for a sec. I could not find a vineyard that was functioning well organically at that point in time, economically. And I did a pretty good job of scouring the landscape, trying to find the farmers at that point in time, and was having not much luck in doing that. And what I'll say here is that, I think whenever we have perennial fruit production, and I've done perennial fruit production, I've done vegetables, I've done livestock, still do livestock, and of all of those, perennial fruit production is the toughest. And it is the hardest, the most challenging, I think, because very often you have these cultivars, these varieties that are susceptible to certain diseases, and those, you don't get to rotate every single year. You basically are creating a habitat that's going to stay fairly intact, and that means that it's fairly easy for certain fungi and then also for certain insects to actually stay in place and habit that as you're trying to do your farming. So, I just want to say from the outset that I do think that perennial fruit production is the most challenging in terms of organic production, but what you get to see by the time we get to the end here, there are some really wonderful horizons some wonderful things on the horizon for us as we move forward. So this is Brunenburg Castle. This is the view that I had every day and still go back fairly frequently, and these days take groups of nutritionists primarily back to look at the sustainability of this particular region in terms of agriculture and share some of this story. But this is the view, and if you look at the view and you sort of see the two mountains that are coming together, the two ridges, that's actually the beginning of what's called the Finchgau Valley, Vinschgau, Finchgau, or in Italian, Val Venosta. And so that actually, in many ways, is the beginning of this story that I want to share with you as we go forward here. So this is the region, just to give you a little bit more context. And when you're looking at the map in front of you here and you see Merano, we're looking at the area that's circled in red. And that is the Finchgau Valley. So if you're looking off to the east, then that's the lower portion of the valley. And it rises up, and rises up until it ends. And where it ends is actually at the intersection point of Austria, Switzerland, and Italy. And there's a town there. The town is called Malz. It's a place that's been at the intersection of these different cultures. It's a place that certainly was threatened by marauders coming from different directions at various points in time. And it's also a place where there are things such as ancient cultic sites that go back to the Bronze Age and Copper Age, and then also to the Stone Age. So it's a place of very, very rich history, and that plays into this story as well. So this is the South Tyrol region, just to give you a little bit more context. It was part of Austria until World War I, and part of the reason that that's important is once it went from Austria into the hands of the Italians, the Italian fascists at that point in time, then they started to change the names of all the different places here. And so everything that was in German also had an Italian name after that. So it is a place where right now it generally it's predominated by the German-speaking language, but the Italian is also part and parcel. And they are part of Italy, and they're part of Italy. They were one of the poorest provinces of all of Italy. Now they're the wealthiest, and much of that is because of agriculture, and also associated with that is the tourism that's been developed over the years. So just to give you a little more context. So when you're looking here, what you're actually seeing is the early stages of the apple harvest. And what was beginning to happen there. And the South Tyroleans were incredibly smart, and they pulled together these farmer cooperatives. And this was starting back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And interestingly enough, these cooperatives became so successful that they also became very powerful political forces, which is also part of the story and the way in which they contribute here. But I think it's important to see that, even at this point, they were already producing apples. This is back in the 1930s, already producing apples for the local market, and then also beginning to build a reputation that was going to grow in terms of apple production in the area. And this also, if I were working in the vineyard there at Brunenburg Castle and I were to throw a stone downhill, I would almost have hit these folks right down below. This is in the 1930s. This is utilizing pesticides at that point in time. And we typically tend to think of pesticides as a modern phenomenon. Part of the way the story gets told very often is that they really amplified after World War II. And that is, in fact, the case. They did amplify because we were able to use so many of the different chemicals that were utilized in World War II, defoliants being one, various insecticides. But they actually go further back. And it's kind of an interesting thing when you look at fruit production and vineyards in particular, because what happened was in Europe, they were very taken in the late 1700s, early 1800s, very taken by the different kinds of grapes that they found in the United States and the different taste and the wines that they made. And Thomas Jefferson and others were very prominent in this whole move. So they actually took some of the vines from the United States. They took them to Europe, and unknowingly, when they did that, they also took two fungal diseases and then also a louse, the Reblaus as it's called in German, or the vine lice, phylloxera is the Latin name for that. So they took those three things with them. And it took a long time. It didn't take long for those two fungal diseases to spread, and it didn't take long for the vine lice to spread, but it took a long time to figure out what was going on. So finally, the Europeans started to realize that their vineyards were dying, and they were getting hammered, and they couldn't figure out what it was. Eventually, they figured out that there were the phylloxera, the vine lice that were in the soil, that were underneath, that were killing them, and they started to figure out the two primary diseases that the vines were having, the fungal diseases, and as a result, they started with what you might even these days hear referred to as the Bordeaux mixture, which is basically copper and sulfur. And so this mixture of copper and sulfur, that wasn't the first pesticide necessarily, but it was one of the most widely used. And so it was used in Europe. Then we also brought it back to the United States. And, fairly effective in some cases for some of the fungal diseases, but that's primarily what was sprayed. Unfortunately, at one point, arsenic was also in the arsenal, which is a little bit ironic. So pesticides have a long history, and I should also say that when you look at cultures like India, there are pesticides there that are organic, that have been used for millennia, that are naturally occurring. And so I think we need to remember that actually these things have a much longer history than we generally talk about. And in this case, what they were spraying for, I'm pretty sure this is probably a petroleum distillate, probably a white oil, Weissöl as it's called in German, and against the tree lice in that particular case. So the small village that I've been going to since 1983, it used to be a very diverse agricultural village. These days, as you walk around, this is almost all of what you see. These are the apples, and we're here just outside of Big Apple. This is Big Apple in the Tyrolean version. And, it is just amazing what's happened in terms of the transition of the landscape. And obviously, with that comes the use of a lot of pesticides. So this is what things look like. The Tyroleans, as I said, the cooperatives were just incredibly smart as they were thinking about how can we actually really start to market apples, make a good profit for the farmers. And so one of the things that they discovered was in 1973, the Dutch were doing a really fantastic job with here what they call the slender tree trellis system. So that is, and you'll see this more and more in the United States, this is something that you start to see quite a bit actually in upper New York State, starting to see it in Vermont, some certainly seeing it in Washington State. And the idea here is that you try to grow the tree, you use a dwarf or a semi-dwarf rootstock, so you actually keep it so it's not going to be too high. When you're able to do this, instead of having the full size or the standard trees, it's actually of some benefit because you can do everything easier. You can certainly do the pruning easier. It's easier to do the irrigation, as you can see here that's set up. It's easier to do the spraying. In theory, at least what's touted is you use fewer pesticides because you're not having to spray into this really deep vegetation in order to try to penetrate to the middle of the tree. So there are some advantages to it, and certainly the harvest itself becomes somewhat easier. Part and parcel of that these days is also putting what you see here on top. These are the hail nets. And the hail nets are actually, they literally are an insurance, but they also mean that the farmers don't necessarily have to buy crop insurance. Instead, they invest in these hail nets. So the hail nets protect against, very volatile, climate that you have there, especially with climate change right now in the Alps. But they also protect against some of the birds that are coming in. They also obviously trap some of the birds. And then also they protect against sun scald, which is something that's very important here. So this is what it starts to look like. And this is sort of the corn and soy equivalent, if you will, of the South Tyrol. This is what happens when Big Apple rolls in, and this is what it starts to look like. And so this is the first information artwork that I'm going to show you here by Douglas Gayton and the Lexicon of Sustainability. And I want to make a couple of comments on that. Part of what we were trying to do is we were trying to figure out how to tell the story was trying to figure out who we could actually capture to convey some of the personalities that create a movement. What do those people look like? And so one of the things that Douglas thought would be fun, since Germans do it all the time, is we would start to make up words and smush them together, essentially. And so the German words that you see here on these different information artworks, as Douglas calls them, they're actually, they are real German words, but we did the compounding and the compositing, and in many cases we did that to show how ludicrous some of the scenarios were that people were actually dealing with. So in this case, what we were trying to convey was, what does Big Apple look like in the South Tyrol? And what's rather astounding is that in the South Tyrol, so a hectare is about 2.5 acres. And on 1 hectare, a farmer can not gross, but a farmer can net between 25,000 and 40,000 euros. And so right now the euro, I think, is at about $1.10, and sometimes it's $1.40. So you start to think about 2.5 acres and being able to actually net $25,000 to $40,000. And many of these farmers, they have smaller parcels because of the inheritance practices here over the years. They have the smaller parcels, but usually they've got, the average apple farmer is 4 to 6 acres here in this particular region. So they're making really good money. And they also get to put that away tax-free because there's a progressive tax policy in Italy which allows them to do so. So essentially what started to happen was the apple farmers started to become wealthier than any of the other farmers in the region. And that's part of the story, and in a sense, the land grabbing is a part of the story because all of a sudden you have these very wealthy farmers who are looking at the potential of being able to grow their apple crop, actually grow their productive capacity, and so they start looking for places where there are no apples. And where are there no apples? There are fewer apples as you start to go up into higher elevations, but what are we dealing with these days? We're dealing with climate change and a warming climate. So all of a sudden, the places where you could not grow apples, you can grow apples. And the Finchgau Valley that I showed you there on the map, that's prime apple territory. 300 days of sunshine, ample water coming in from all of the glaciers and the snow melt from all sides. Just an incredible place to put apples. But with that comes a cost, and that cost is that the apple growers wanted perfect cosmetic apples. So if you're traveling in Europe right now and you buy an apple, there's a 1 in 7 chance that it came from the South Tyrol because they've become so famous for these beautiful, magnificent apples that they are so careful with in the harvest. But part of that means that they also are using a number of different pesticides in the process in order to maintain that cosmetic beauty. And so as a result, right now, it's the highest use of pesticides anywhere in Italy at about 42 kilograms per hectare. So 42 kilograms of pesticides per 2.5 acres, which is heavy. And so there's quite the cost to it, which sort of balances out that seeming wealth that's starting to come in. But the story has a much kind of richer background. And there's, just as I was mentioning, there's incredible history. How many folks have heard of the Iceman? Generally no. So the Iceman, who in I believe it was 1993, was discovered, and it was sort of ironic because my boss, Cizzo, who was overseeing the farm, he was also one of the leading archaeologists in the South Tyrol and was running the archaeological museum for the province. And so he came home one night and he said, well, the glaciers are melting, which we all know. Unfortunately, even in the 90s, it was clear the glaciers were melting. He said, so they found another cadaver as the glaciers started to recede. And that particular year, there was also a windstorm that came from the Sahara, whipped across the Mediterranean, and had this yellowish-brown sand. Those granules were actually in the atmosphere, and they were embedding in the glacier. So with the warm temperatures, that was accelerating the ice melt that summer. And so, lo and behold, you get the Iceman, Ötzi as he's known there by the locals. But when they first found him and Sito came home the first night, it was like, well, they think maybe this guy's from World War I. And then the next day, well, it may actually be someone from the Middle Ages. And then by day 3 or day 4, they found this axe that seems to be with him, and he may actually be a lot older. By the time it was all said and done, it was clear that he was 5,300 years old, and just an extraordinary find. And the thing that in part is so amazing about him is that the cadaver was intact, but also the implements and the clothing, all of that was there. And it was an amazing find, because when you start to look at Ötzi, when you start to look at the Iceman, in fact, he was carrying this wealth of food traditions with him that's a reminder to this day in this region. He was living, and at least he was roaming just above the Finchgau Valley when he died. And it seems he was murdered. There was an artery that was cut just above his shoulder, and so they think now, he probably bled to death in 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, probably being chased by someone else. But what was really amazing in the find was they were able to find some of the food that was there with him, and not only that, but after 10 years, because he was a perfectly preserved cadaver, but he was also dehydrated, which is sort of what happens with a glacial mummy. And in that dehydration process, they lost his stomach. They couldn't figure out where his stomach was. And after 10 years, they finally found it. It had dried and shriveled, and it was up underneath one of the lungs. And so at that point, they were able, and they're very careful as they do this. The Iceman is still in the museum in Bolzano. You can go see him through the little window if you want. But they started to look at his whole gastrointestinal tract. And part of what they were able to do, which I find just fascinating, is they were able to go in and they were able to figure out what he ate in the last 72 hours of his life. And they were able to figure out, in part, probably what elevation he ate it at. Because it was clear he was being chased up and down. And so in this case, they were able to use the pollen samples because the pollens are so different at the different elevations. And he was being chased. He was going up and down in those last 72 hours. And so there were different pollen grains that were associated with what he was taking in. So it turns out what we think we know about Ötzi right now is he was probably lactose intolerant somewhat. He had his last meal was of a wild goat. He also had been eating some red deer. They're still trying to figure out exactly which part of that red deer he'd eaten. He also had several grains with him that are still grown and really recognized and appreciated in this region. So he had einkorn, emmer, spelt, and millet with him. These are all grains that are still very much cherished in this region, and they're part of the story. So here you have this cadaver, you have this history of over 5,000 years, also of a history that involves livestock at this point in time. So I'm going to show you some of these areas. Whenever you get above tree line, that's a great place to take your livestock to graze animals because those grasses are very, very high nutritionally, very high in nutrition. And it also gives you a place as you're making your hay down in the valleys or on the slopes. It gives you a place to make hay while you actually have your animals grazing up top. And even at this point in time, it seems they were using the areas above tree line for some of the grazing practices. So just a little reminder. So let's see, the Iceman was found here just about almost halfway up the valley, up on the northern slopes, and there's a whole interesting story we can go into there, but probably don't have time today. But basically, they found certain mosses with him that they think probably used for toilet paper, and those mosses grow on one side of the valley, or one side of the mountain and not the other. So it seems that probably he was associated more with this particular side of the Finchgau. So this is the town of Malz. And so again, it's M-A-L-S. In Italian, it's Malles Fenosta. And it actually is a municipality of 11 different villages. And so this is the main village here. This is the village of Malz that you see. And it's 92 square miles, just an extraordinary area that I'm going to show you a little bit more with some aerial views here in just a minute. But an amazing place that, again, is at the confluence of all of this passage of people going in and out of Switzerland, Austria, and Italy, all together here. And my friend in the upper right-hand corner there, Brigitte, I was taking a group back, a group of graduate students in 2014, and she said, Philip, I know one of your favorite places in the world is Malta, and you should know they're actually having a referendum to ban all pesticides in Malta. Holy smokes. So quickly called the folks that I work with the bus company and said, can we change things around here? Because we're going to go see some stuff and find out what's going on in Malta. Because in my mind at that point in time, it was the only place in the world that had ever had a public referendum in order to ban all pesticides. And still to this day, I haven't found another example of that happening prior to Malta doing it, to the people of Malta. So, I shifted around the syllabus, and this photo that you see here is a really neat little guest house. A friend of mine, Messner is his name, and he's an interesting character who really, Konrad Messner, and Konrad tells stories in just incredible fashion. So I took my students there because he was one of the kind of the folks who was really the gadflies, who was pushing this along. So we went into his guest house, and we listened to him for about 2 hours tell the story of what happened, which I'm about to share with you here. So this is Malta. This is back in the 1940s, and you can see that a very diversified agriculture. Here they were still growing grain. They were actually known as the breadbasket of the Tyrol, and the British family and the papacy both did everything they could to get grains from this particular area, because the grains are being grown at very high elevations, anywhere from 1,000 meters above sea level up to 1,700 meters. They were considered some of the most nutritious and tasty in all of Europe, and that's why they were considered the breadbasket of the Tyrol. You can actually also see down in the bottom corner there that there are also potatoes there. So a diversified agriculture, as you'll see here. This is back in I believe the 1970s. You can see all the different fields that are here, which gives you some indication that it was fairly diverse. It wasn't all apples, that being the point. So this is Malta. This I took 3 summers ago, and as you see the video that's about to play here, what I'd like you to do is to look for the dark green spots, because those are primarily apple orchards, a couple cherry orchards mixed in. But those are the apple orchards that are starting to march in. So I'll give you a little tour here. So this is Malta from above. There is some music in the background, but that's okay either way. So this gives you a little bit of sense of these different villages that are tucked around, 92 square miles. As you see those slopes as they go up, those areas are still mowed for pasture. This is the middle of Malta. This is the local agricultural school located in a castle. The population is about, 5,000. So there you also see on the white, that is the highest Benedictine monastery in Central Europe, which also has now, as I'll tell you, an organic vineyard, biodynamic. Gives you a little sense of the topography. These are all grazing lands here at above 2,000 meters. Guest house. People tend to go to eat and drink. Spectacular landscape all the way through. Back in the background there, you see the highest mountains in the South Tyrol, including the Ortler, which is 3,900 meters. There you can see some of the apple orchards starting to move in. There you see a mosaic of all the different things that are being grown, including apples now. That hill that you see in the background was an ancient Stone Age cultic site. Hill there, the Tarchibuku, as they call it. Church on top of it, make sure you claim it. There, the high alpine farms all along the slopes. That is the receding glacier that's up above. That is the top suicide pact they've got there. So thanks to Red Bull for sponsoring that. I don't think that fits, but some reason they thought that was important. Yeah. So, this again, is the setting for our story, and I'll tell you just a little bit more here as we go about the realities. Because in the middle of the Finchgau Valley, this is the reality. This is what happens when everything is transitioned to apples. And I'll give you a little taste of this. And by way of this story, this is the Gluterer family. They're folks who've become really good friends of my family here over the last couple of years because they had an organic herb business. And what's fascinating is that Urban, who is the father, Urban decided that he wanted to change careers. He was working with mentally disabled adults. And part of what was happening in the process was they asked him if he would help them learn how to do certain kinds of farming. And so they started producing teas that they could grow, they could package, and then they could sell as part of the career development for these folks. And Urban just got really fascinated. And he realized, well, this is sort of an odd contrast because I have this orchard, which was conventionally managed, and I'm out there spraying, and here I am working by day, with all of these people and pushing all of the principles of organic. He said it just didn't feel like everything aligned very well. So he decided that maybe there was this business opportunity when he turned 40 in order to change things around and start an organic herb farm. So that's what he and his wife did. He did it with the help of his father and mother. When it was all said and done, which is right now, 4 generations started to contribute to putting together this organic herb farm. And it was awesome, and it was profitable, and it was working out. But then the apple orchards started to move in until it got to the point where they were entirely surrounded by apple orchards. And as a result of being entirely surrounded by apple orchards, they were dealing with pesticide drift, so that suddenly all of the crops that they were producing were tainted by this pesticide drift. And of course, they had to have things tested in order to be organic. And it got to be so bad that they decided, okay, well, maybe we can have these really tall hedgerows. So they had tall trees put in all around the farm. That didn't do it. Then they decided they would build what they call in German a water curtain. So they would shoot these kind of fans of water up all the way across, all the way around the perimeter. So 30 feet high on all sides whenever they started spraying. They'd turn on these water curtains so that they'd be spraying up and hopefully capturing the water or capturing the pesticides. And then those pesticides in the water would be taken elsewhere off-site. That didn't do the trick. So at that point they said, all right, so we have a choice. We can either stay here and we can fight the system and try to find a way to actually live within it, or we can move. But if we surrender, then everybody else is going to surrender. And so they said, we're going to stick it out. So they invested, at that point, 250,000 euros. At that point in time, it was just over $300,000 to cover their entire farm in greenhouses. Everything except for a little piece of show garden, which was around the outside, which they can't use or sell anything from that because it's tainted with pesticides. They covered the entire thing with these high tunnels. And what that means is they are protected from pesticides, and they have to do the testing, and that's good, I suppose. But also, when it rains and the water comes down and it hits those high tunnels, that water has to be taken off-site because it's tainted with pesticides. That's how bad it is. When they're working inside, and I've taken student groups in at various times, when they're working inside, it can get up to over 120 degrees inside because of those. And so the last time I was there and talking to Urban and his son Manuel, they said our goal in 7 years is to be able to work in an environment that's not 120 degrees. We want to make sure that the policies around us change so that we get to the point where if they're going to be apple farms around us, they're going to be organic apple farms. And we can't keep doing this. So their business is very successful. They're really amazing folks, but they've also borne the brunt of a lot of enmity of people around them. And in part, perhaps, it's because they've done all these videos. They have the last time we talked, they had over 300 different videos of the pesticide spraying that's going on. This is taken from their house. You can start to get a sense of what's happening with the pesticides. This is something that is not unique to this area, and yet this area, because it's sort of a funnel, essentially, this valley, you have what people call in dialect the Finchgewind, the Finchgau wind, which sometimes blows for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And if you're a farmer and you're trying to spray pesticides, typically every 7 to 14 days, that doesn't necessarily jibe. You also see the thermal updraft that you get here by virtue of being in a climate like this. And you also start to get a sense that, part of what we've done in pesticide development is we've actually created these aerosols. The idea is that we wanted to penetrate the foliage of the trees and the vines as extensively as possible. And to do that, you try to get the droplets as small as possible. So you create these aerosols, you're trying to blast it into the trees, but at the same time, this is what happens. Those aerosols can be lifted. So now what they're finding is, even at the lakes that are above 2,000 meters, they're finding pesticide residues there. So, we think we're fixing one thing in the pesticide industry, and it's just this constant treadmill of actually creating more problems for ourselves in so many cases. So, unfortunately, one of the very first farmers in Malz to experience this himself was a fellow named Gunther Wallnerfe, and this is Gunther here with his cattle. And if you'll see just on the edges of the information artwork here, you'll see that there are orchards on both sides. And unfortunately for Gunther, what happened was that he was flanked by 2 neighbors with different orchards that popped up. These orchards popped up after he'd transitioned his family's farm, which is primarily a dairy farm. He transitioned it to organic. And so, the critical piece there to be organic is the animals are grazing in pastures that are not tainted with pesticides, and that hay can be cut also in places that are free of pesticides. And he knew he was in trouble when he saw these orchards go in 2009. And so the orchards were there, and they only needed at this point in time, a 3-meter buffer, so just under 10 feet, a 3-meter buffer between the orchard, actually between the center of the tree and his field. That was the required buffer, for these farms, and that was it. And so he had his first crop of hay tested, I believe that was in 2012, had the first crop tested, and sure enough, tainted with pesticides. And not only that, he had to pay, I think it was about 250 euros per sample that he sent in. He had to pay out of his own pocket. And so the second cut of hay, same thing, tainted with pesticides. Third cut of hay, same thing. And his organic certifier said, not only can you not use that hay, you have to get it off your farm because we consider it toxic, essentially, because you have the pesticides. So he said, what was I supposed to do? Here I am. I've got these fields that have been managed organically. He said, probably some of them for 5,000 plus years. We've known how to do this, and suddenly I'm confronted with this different kind of farming that's moving in, and it's endangering my livelihood. So what am I supposed to do? So it was a really confounding situation for him in trying to figure it out. And so he was fortunate in that things were beginning to change in this whole area. He experienced several of the first orchards that started to pop up. But Malz had started in part with a new mayor who had just been elected. Malz was beginning to think about, can we actually be an organic region? Is that something that's going to work for us agriculturally? And is that also something that's going to work for us from the perspective of tourism? And so they started to think, as they called it, this bioregion, this bioregion, this organic region. Could they actually move in that direction? And Konrad, who was the storyteller who shared his part of the story with us, had formed a group called Kornkammer, which means bread basket, essentially. And these farmers were getting together. They were looking at the old grains that were found with the Iceman. They were looking at ways in which they could propagate, first of all, find those old varieties. Secondly, how they could propagate them. Thirdly, how they could actually utilize them in the marketplace and get them into some of the local traditional breads again, and to do that organically. So that was popping up, and then the same time there was the first whiskey distillery in all of Europe popped up in this area, because that also, it's an area that grows rye much better than it does wheat. And so there was a whiskey distillery that was just taking off in Malz. There was the first organic hotel in the entire region. And yes, there are organic hotels. This is a movement that hasn't hit the United States very much, But when you go into an organic hotel, the linens obviously are going to be organic cotton. The cleaning supplies are going to be organic certified. The food is going to be organic. The beverages, even the distilled beverages and the wines and the beers, everything is organic. And what's that? Not all of it yet, and part of what they're dealing with, the question was the rye they were using organic, and not yet, but that's a movement that's really beginning to grow and blossom, quite a bit. So, it's an issue of supply at this point in time, and so, I think it's something they'd like to move toward, I'm sure. And then one of the things that even happened, just to show you how far these things can go, what you see in the lower right-hand corner there is my friend Beatrice, who became one of the progenitors of the movement, and she's just amazing. She's a hairdresser. She said, if I'm going to start talking about pesticides and all these things in the environment, and then I'm putting heavy metals and other chemicals on the heads of my clients, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so, she actually, by the end of the story, she became one of the first organic hairdressers in all of Italy, and the first in this region, and has been recognized by hairdressers throughout Europe as being this amazing proponent, not just of the cosmetics industry, but also of having healthy food. So you start to see that here these people were there, this consciousness was there, it was raised, they were ready to go, and then Big Apple starts to move in. The other Tyrolean version of Big Apple starts to really step in and begin to take control in some ways. But they didn't want to let that happen. And so they had this fellow. They were very, very lucky to have Ulrich Veit, and Uli, as he's known around town, ULI. And Uli's just an amazing mayor who he grew up in the area. He decided that he wanted to really help the sustainability of the region. They were figuring out now with mini hydropower, they were becoming sustainable in terms of electricity. They had a train that they'd put in that had been closed down. They got the new train up and going. They were converting that to electric with the help of the Swiss. And so all of these things were happening where they were trying to get this momentum and go forward. But Gunther, the farmer with the organic dairy, who said, my family, this is the only way we can get a farm to survive. I only have enough space to have 25 cows. That's it. And so it has to be an organic product that I sell in order to make this work. So he went to Uli and he said, Uli, we got to do something because it's not just about me. It's about every farmer in this area. If they're growing grains, they're going to have issues. If they have organic vineyard, which was the case in a couple of places, all of the farmers are going to be impacted. And if it gets so far that it's like the Gluterer family down in the middle of the valley where they've got the organic herbs and they're surrounded by apples, there's no future for us at that point in time. And so Uli was very smart, and one of the first tactics that he did was he'd been working in Switzerland quite a bit, and Switzerland in many ways is one of the homes of the ideas, the concepts, and the practices of direct democracy. That, yes, we have a representative government, but the people are the first who should have the power in order to advance things. And so they're very popular with public referendums. And so Uli made a change with the town council that any referendum put forward by the public to the public would, in fact, be binding. And what that means in this case, and there are different ways you can make it binding, but he decided that it would be important that the town council take up the issue if it was put forward, that it be binding in that regard. Not that it was actually the ordinance that was being provided, but that the town council had to deal with it. So he did that fairly quietly. But then started to develop these ideas more and more, thinking about direct democracy. And so by 2014, they put forward a referendum. They were very, very careful in how they started to think about this referendum. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go along. But with that referendum, it was a 2-week polling period. They wanted to make sure everybody could vote. They also, the town council and Uli had to be quiet during those 2 weeks. They couldn't push forward things. They couldn't push forward their own ideas. And as I'll show you, this all came about after about 2 years of groundwork being laid by the citizens of Maltz and trying to educate themselves about what the issues were with pesticides. So one of the key players, actually she and her husband, this is Edith, and Edith and her husband Robert retired to this area, which was where Robert grew up. They retired here. and they started collecting all of the old varieties of grains and vegetables that they could in the area. And people thought, well, maybe Robert and Edith, they're sort of doing their own thing. It's this hobby. It's, they're kind of eclectic. But what they ended up doing before it was popular, this started back in the 1990s, was they actually started saving these old grain varieties, finding them and saving them and putting them forward. In fact, there's a great story that I've got in the book where there was a neighbor who was taking the tile roof off of his house, and when he did it, he found a newspaper from the late 1800s, and in that newspaper, folded up, were 2 heads of grain, spelt as it turned out, which they actually then planted, and now that's been propagated by a lot of the farmers in the area as this old variety of spelt that they have. So, what everybody thought at one point was just something that was just kind of, the thing Robert and Edith did turned out to be something that was really critical. And here you have Robert, and Robert's quite a character, and as he tells the story, the only way for us to save our marriage is for us to have a division of labor, and the division of labor is the top of the soil. I take care of everything below ground. She takes care of everything above ground. And they're just these extraordinary folks, and you go, they have 6 different gardens. One of them is this display garden that you see here, which is just extraordinary when you walk around and you see the diversity, and obviously all managed organically. And then they also have different fields where they've got the different grain trials and other things going on around. And just this is their retirement. This is what they do. Yeah, so the question was, did they need to let the ground lay fallow for a couple of years and have the 3-year transition period for organic, which is required in most places. In this case, they were able to go to fields that had been managed organically, maybe not certified, but interestingly, one of the things that Robert does not like is liquid manure, that's spread on the fields. Because he said these old grains, they don't need this rich soil. In fact, that's when they have diseases and they have problems. He's not saying not to take care of the fertility, but he's saying to do it by means of compost and other things and not liquefied manure, because he said that actually hurts the soil biology and creates problems. So while they may have been managed organically, and he said in a lot of cases they just have to sort of let some of that nitrogen dissipate over time. Oh, oops, I'm sorry. And then you have folks like Edward and Helga here, who, Edward's family had been doing this forever, it seems, generations, growing these grains, but then they were realizing that these traditions were being lost. So Edward, you'll see him out in the field quite a bit, growing these different grains. Helga has decided that it's really critical to teach school children, farmers' wives, tourists, everyone she can, how to actually process the grains inside the house, and then also how to do the baking. And it's those kind of folks, it's the people that just retain these standards and these traditions that are so important in a story like this. And this is Conrad, whom I mentioned early on. And Conrad, I think, here just represents the fact we have to have the gadflies. We have to have the people who are out there pushing these ideas forward. And I think Conrad would probably call himself a social entrepreneur, someone who's helping people see the cohesiveness of all these different possibilities and how to bring together these different ideas in order to galvanize and strengthen the community and move things forward. And then it's incumbent also on some of the folks who are fairly mainstream in what they're doing. This is a bakery now that has been going for 3 generations. And the young man that you see here, the sourdough bread, you can sort of see the containers that are tucked under the left there. That's the traditional sourdough bread that he's making. And that starter is about 3 years older than he is. And so they've been continuing this sourdough starter. And they're trying to do as much as they can to buy both local and organic. And still struggling with the supply. The supply is not there yet. The last time he and I talked this past summer, I think he was able to get about 17% local and 11% organic that was also local. And so it's about building the supply and really re-energizing this social economy, or as they would call it there, the circular economy. And then this is the guy that, as I told you at the very beginning, I couldn't find that person doing fruits who was doing those things organically in the early 1990s. As it turned out, Gideus here, whom you see, Aegidius, just right at that point in time, this now is about 34, 35 years ago, he went from being conventional to organic. And what's amazing about Aegidius is he's proven that it can be done. When you walk through his orchard, if I hadn't seen his orchard and vineyards, I never would have believed what I actually saw coming out of there. Just extraordinary. And what's amazing about him is he does, and if you're organic certified, you're allowed to use a certain amount of copper and a certain amount of sulfur. He doesn't even use copper or sulfur. He doesn't even use compost, which I found rather extraordinary. So what he basically does is, as he describes it, is to follow the virtuous cycle of life. And so as the production starts during the year, the only time that he uses the tractor, he uses it on two different occasions. One is at the end of June, early July, he goes through and he mows the rows. He doesn't mow between the trees, he mows the rows so that he's just got better access. And then you see his scythe here, and I asked him, why are you carrying around a broken scythe? You know, there's nothing on the end. And he said, this is the tool that makes all the difference. And so he takes the blade off the scythe and turns it upside down. There's a rubber grip on the bottom, and he walks between the trees, and he swings it, and he breaks the stems of all the grasses that are there. I said, well, what's the deal there? What are you doing? He said, I'm providing basically habitat for the beneficials. Because the beneficials, when they're in balance, if I go in and I mow, then I've ruined the habitat for the beneficial insects that can go in and take care of these other problematic pests that I've got. So just an extraordinary orchard that he has there. And Aegidius became one of the proponents, and as you'll see, it has an interesting part of the story as it moves along. But those examples are there now, and that's the beauty of it. And then there were people, who were ordinary in the sense of doing the extraordinary work of motherhood. As you have here, these are two really interesting folks, mother and daughter. And the mother grew up here, and she said, the only thing when I grew up on the farm, when I grew up in malts, the only things that we brought in were sugar, salt, and coffee. Otherwise, we were able to be reasonably self-sufficient. And she said, and people didn't have food allergies. And now the grandson has these extraordinary food allergies. And so what they're doing is working together to bring back the old foods, the old food ways, the old grains, bring those back into the household and try to deal with the food allergies. And they're being reasonably successful in that regard. But I think, this is just another reminder that I think in particular, my hats off, to the mothers, because I think there's this, women are the most important part of these movements, I think. And I say that in all honesty. And the only reason that I've been able to come up with what it is that happens, what women really bring to the table, it is that nature, nurture, and nutrition. And, men should do a better job. I'm not providing us a way out. But I think this has been carried forward. And this is why so many of these movements, I think, are really dependent upon mothers who've been paying attention and are paying attention, and fathers need to pay more attention now. So then also another key player here was the veterinarian, the town veterinarian, who he said, I'm driving around, I drive around every day, and I see what's going on in this area. And he said, we've had healthy animals here for the most part for, as documented now, over 5,000 years. And I'm watching these rich apple farmers come in with all their money, and they're buying out the livestock farmers, changing the landscape. And he said, these are traditions that we need to protect. And, in so many ways, Peter, who is the vet you see here in the bluish-green pants, he's just been this incredible steward of the environment, because who else sees more about what's going on in a community than a large animal vet in a place like this, where you're going to the farms, you're going in the barns, you're going in the farmhouses. And he said, we're going to lose this tradition if we're not careful. And then, just these other folks who are these amazing social entrepreneurs, and this is Alexander Ackerman-Leis, just an incredible farmer. He has one of these small farms within a village, so the barn is within the village and the fields are on the outside. And Alexander, no matter what he does, he can't milk more than 12 cows. That's the limit. That's all his farm, that's all the barn will hold, and that's all the land that he's got. And so he decided back about a decade ago that he was going to have to figure out a way to make 12 cows work if he was going to continue to have this kind of agriculture. And so what Alexander did was he said, well, I can start making cheese, and that'll be the value-added product that I think will turn this around. So he needed about €250,000 to do it. So he went down to the local tax police, and he said, I'd like to print my own currency. And they said, you'd like to do what? He said, well, I'd like to print my own currency. It'll be currency for my farm, which is the Engelhorn is the name of the farm. And he said, and I'd like to call the currency the Engelhorne. And so he talked to the tax authorities. They did their research. They said, well, actually, there's no law against printing your own currency as long as you pay your taxes. And so what he did was he developed the Engelhorn, and an Engelhorn is worth 1 kilo of cheese. And so people could buy cheese for 10 years out. So they could basically they could purchase the currency, which gave them the cheese for the next 10 years, whatever quantity they bought. And then that gave him €165,000 to move forward in building the cheese cave, buying the equipment that he needed. And he'd raised all of that successfully. And what happened, and he didn't realize it was going to happen, there are places like hotels in Munich and some other spots where they love his cheese. So they actually preemptively bought some Engelhorner. So they buy the cheese, but then also, if you're someone who bought some of the Engelhorner, you can pay for your hotel in Engelhorner, and then that all just sort of keeps what they're calling the circular economy going. And what's wonderful about what he and his wife have done is they've decided that really they're a hub of entrepreneurship for other people that want to get into agriculture. And so they share their facilities, they help other farmers get up and started. But just this past summer, I saw Alexander took a group there, and he said, yeah, we found pesticides on one of my hay fields. He said, the cow is the filter, and I can't maintain this business if I can't maintain the purity of the pasture and the hay that I've got here. So that's the intensity of it, but also sort of the purity of intent, I would say, on part of Alexander and some of the others. And so Alexander and others decided that they would, do something really interesting, that they would actually start to utilize the arts in many ways to start to educate people. So Äpfel is the dialect word for apple, which sounds a little bit like Eve, so Adam and Eve. So they started taking all these Baroque medieval images of Adam and Eve and utilizing those to talk about the temptation of the apple. What happens if we succumb to that temptation? What does that do to our future? Which obviously has all kinds of references embedded in it. But they got really playful with it, as you'll see here. So they decided in 2013 that they would actually do a tour where people could go through and they could look at what paradise looked like as it was at the moment. And so they had this map. This is with the different villages. They invited people to walk, to take their bikes, to drive, whatever they'd like to do. E-bikes are a huge thing there now, so a lot of folks on e-bikes. So they put serpents in all kinds of places throughout the entire valley. So there's a wooden serpent that you see there in the upper left. When you went into one of the villages, you would be greeted by Eve with the temptation of the apple. One of the Eves was walking around with a live snake. There were snakes in the grass, has all kinds of illusions, I guess. But just trying to show that paradise was potentially going to be disrupted if they weren't careful. And then the whiskey distillery, they had a good time at the end of the day going down to the whiskey distillery here with all of the costumes that they'd had. And what they were really trying to do was utilize the arts to bring forward the issues as much as possible. And then the next year, they did something similar. This time they decided that they would sort of provide the fruits of paradise, let everybody taste the things that were there and that they had as a possibility. So as you see in the upper left, they were doing a wine tasting. Because in the process of all of this, there was a Belgian who moved in and put in an organic vineyard. And then, as it turned out, the Benedictine monastery that I pointed out there, the abbot realized that monks aren't necessarily pesticide-free, and his monks weren't, they were using pesticides. And he said, we will be organic, and we'll also put in a vineyard to create our own communion wine, which will also be organic and biodynamically managed. So the wines were beginning to kick in. They had stews, they had beekeepers, and what you see down in the bottom right-hand corner is this beautiful exhibit now that's been traveling all over Europe that Robert and Edith did, which is all of the grain varieties that they've been working on and saving. And so not only are they showing, the importance of the genetics here, they're also showing the aesthetic piece. And they did all of this at their own expense. All the wooden frames and glass covered, I mean, they're just magnificent and gives the whole history really of the grain traditions, really of Central Europe and Asia and Africa. So we created this image, which I think for all of you is a really important one to think about. This is Alexander who's cutting his hay there. And what Douglas and I were trying to represent, there were over 100 pesticides that were being used in apple orchards and vineyards. And so we took as many as we could squeeze into this image, and we just put them all out there. Because there are cases in which a farmer will use between 25 and 35 different pesticides in one given orchard, one given vineyard throughout the course of a single year. And what I'd like to say is that I think we hear about IPM, integrated pest management. There has been an attempt to reduce the resistance that tends to build up among insects and fungal diseases by virtue of spraying a lot of different things. But what we've done in the process is we've created this incredible cocktail, which, first of all, we don't even know what the individual pesticides are doing. Secondly, we don't know what the adjuvants are that are added to the pesticides. And thirdly, we sure as heck don't know what's going on in terms of the mixture of all these different elements. And so these are called the combinative effects of pesticides. And there are different kinds of interactions that can happen as these pesticides get mixed in among one another. One is it can be additive. Another is that things build on top of each other. Another is that you get a synergistic effect, that the two chemicals together actually start to do things that you never expected or certainly weren't intended. And the other is that they can actually be antagonistic, so that they're actually working against each other and creating some things, some scenarios that are fairly dangerous. So, what's amazing to me and just astounding about the pesticide industry is we have the pesticides, that is the active ingredients themselves, and then those are regulated to some degree, but then you have basically the solutions or the additives that are there, the adjuvants that are there with them, often keeping them in suspension, for which there is no regulation. And in many cases, if you pick up a pesticide container, you look, the active ingredient will be between 1% and 5%. The rest of it is 95%, which in most cases is considered a trade secret. And if you have an issue where you have the toxicity issue, you call the Poison Control Center, then they may not have access to that trade secret. So it's not only the pesticides and the active ingredients, it's also these adjuvants, which now have, we've started to see different things pop up in those adjuvants that are actually, some scientists think are more dangerous than the active ingredients themselves. So this is what we're dealing with. This is just incredible cocktail. And in this case, we picked up on a saying that was used by one of the researchers here in the U.S., where he talks about the molecular bull in a china shop. And in this case, the Germans use elephant instead of bull. But it's this molecular bull that's there. We don't even know what those bulls are in many cases as they're running around interacting with one another. So I hope that folks pay a lot of attention to the precautionary principle, because this is something that I think is really important as we go along. Precautionary principle really is this question of who bears the burden of proof. Is it the manufacturers of these different things, or is it us, the citizens and the consumers? It really should be borne upon the manufacturers, and yet, for some reason, it should be incumbent upon the manufacturers to show the safety of whatever it is they're producing. Instead, it ends up on government's backs, on our backs, and government ignores it sometimes, all too often. We have to prove the dangers of it. And so the precautionary principle is something that's utilized by the UN and virtually every other industrialized country, not utilized very much here in the United States. And it's something that if you're interested in this, you should try and push forward. Unfortunately, malts had a pharmacist. Everybody needs a pharmacist. But when you're dealing with pesticides and you're talking about parts per million, parts per billion, you really need a pharmacist. Because the pharmacist is the scientist who can tell you just how important it is when you're dealing with parts per million and parts per billion. And Johannes, the town pharmacist here, ended up being the spokesperson for malts. And at pretty significant risk to himself, his family grave was desecrated, his organic vegetable garden was tainted. He just 2 weeks ago was released from a lawsuit by several farmers who had said that he was basically performing illegally as the spokesperson for this group. But the medical community is so critical. And then also having a pediatrician, and this is Elizabeth Viertler, Dr. Elizabeth Viertler, who's the pediatrician in town. And fortunately, she and Johannes, the pharmacist, got together, and they started to pull together the medical community to the point that they created a petition, a manifesto for the health and safety of humans, all of the biodiversity in the area, and put forward this manifesto. And I'll just give you a glimpse. You can look it up online if you like. And they got every single medical doctor, veterinarian, dentist, wildlife biologist, anyone who had a doctorate degree in the natural sciences. I think they got all but 3 to sign on to this manifesto. And that matters, because bringing together the scientific community to take this on at a community scale is really important. So this is the manifesto. You can check that out if you like on the topplinggoliath.org site. I encourage you to do that. But things weren't happening fast enough. There wasn't really just enough intensity. The Maltzers, the people of Maltz, they had 24 different gatherings where they were bringing speakers in from all over Europe to talk about the safety issues of pesticides. But still, they weren't getting traction with the politicians and the media. So as it turned out, Beatrice, who's sort of in the middle in the purple shirt, she got together with Martina, who is to the side there. Beatrice and Martina got together, and just simply because Martina was getting her hair cut, and Beatrice said, "What's going on? There's not much noise happening here about the pesticides," and it was kind of anathema to talk too much about it. So they said, "Well, let's try and do something." And so they got together, and they put together a letter to the editor, and then Martina wrote it, and then Beatrice spread it around. And they ended up getting, I believe it was 83 different people to sign on and put this letter to the editor in the local newspaper in order to push this issue. And part of what they did that was so important that you can see here is they were asking the mayor to take care of the health of the people and the environment in the area. And in the EU, so far, if a mayor determines that there is anything that endangers the health of his or her citizens, he or she can do whatever is necessary in order to protect the health. And that ended up being a really vital step in this whole process. And so they started to activate sort of the chain of command there, move that forward. Then one day they decided they would get together with all the women, and they, actually one night, and they got the Tyvek pesticide suits. They went up into one of the barns overnight. They stuffed the Tyvek suits with hay, and then they had various placards that they put on front for each of the different pesticides that were predominant in the apple industry. And under the cover of darkness, right before the city market opened in the morning, they went down and they put these Tyvek straw men, if you want to call them that, all around the marketplace so that people could actually start to read about and think about what was coming if the apples, in fact, started to move in. And at that point, they also adopted their name, Horlevint, which in dialect just means stop right there, don't take another step, watch out. And it became a band primarily of women, of about 80 women, who were really the ones who, I think, put this on both the local stage and the international stage before it was all done. So they also decided that they would do a banner campaign where they, because they're a tourist town, they have lots of bed sheets. And so they also had stencils. They got together one night and they created these banners that basically were calling for a pesticide-free future. So they were all gathered together. They were stenciling these banners that they were going to drape off of the balconies and put them in front of the yards all around throughout the village, all in one night. They were going to do that together and just have those unfurled. And when the sun came up, then suddenly everybody would see this campaign was alive and well and moving forward. But in that discussion, not Beatrice, but Pia Oswald, who is a really interesting character here in the mix, and she's a nanny, but also a beekeeper, and has this amazing permaculture garden. She said, whatever we put on these banners, it can't be negative. We have to have a positive campaign. So we should not use the words no, not, never. don't. Instead, we'll use positive words. And as a result, that's when they really came forward with this notion of a pesticide-free future, and that's what everybody could get behind, would be a pesticide-free future. So these banners appeared throughout. Many of them still hang to this day as you drive around malts. And in this case, they were linking together this notion of not only protecting the people, but also protecting the guest. And that was a leverage point by virtue of talking about making sure that the guests were protected, the agritourism piece. And as I said, the abbot was full force behind them and even let them put this banner in front of the monastery. This was the same time that Pope Francis had his encyclical come out for the environment. So all of these things were beginning to galvanize, and people were coming at this from lots of different directions, from the scientific perspective, from the social perspective, and certainly, in this case, also from the spiritual perspective. So they created these really wonderful documents that went out to push people forward to vote yes for a pesticide-free future, and that's how the referendum was actually written. And the sunflower just sort of inadvertently became really the symbol of the whole movement with with yes. And so during the 2 weeks of the election, sunflowers suddenly appeared throughout the village and in the water troughs and everywhere you looked, on the pavement, just as a reminder that there was a call for a pesticide-free future. And so they did, as the referendum, amazingly, 69% of the population contributed to the vote. 75% of the population voted for a pesticide-free future. Really extraordinary in and of itself, and has carried them forward. So it's an amazing thing, and then there's a long part of the story that goes here, but the ordinances were put into place in April 2018. A provincial court said that they needed to be put on ice until they could figure out whether that was actually going to be legal. Things are being arbitrated right now in the courts. There was this lawsuit which was against Johannes, the pharmacist, against the mayor, against the town council from some of the farmers. That got thrown out, as I said, just a couple of weeks ago. So when they go to Rome, there's this question of whether, as they do the appeal, Rome seems to be potentially more sympathetic, but then they also already have a letter from the health minister of the EU saying that they were within their rights to do what was necessary. The mayor was within his rights to do what was necessary to protect the health of the people. So it's one of those things, I think, as we move forward on any of these movements, there's this constant litigation. This is part of what we deal with, but they keep advancing forwards, and it's not always easy. As you'll see here, Gideus, this is in his orchard, and there's a high price to be paid in some cases. This was 2 falls ago. Someone came into his orchard which had not seen anything, no copper, no sulfur, no compost for 30 years. And unfortunately, someone came and sprayed Roundup and decimated his orchard. Pretty traumatic event for him. Obviously, that his ability to say that he had organic produce was compromised at that point. It was a pretty serious economic loss, but people did pitch in, to help him out financially from around the village. He did recuperate, from that, and right now is beginning to travel the world to tell the story of malts and of how to pursue these organic futures. So that was a hard one to see. But there, on the other hand, yeah, his crop. So that probably from one of the paved roads from the side. I mean, it hit in particular the 2 rows that were closest to the road. So that seems to be the most likely piece. Absolutely, it was done intentionally. Yeah. Intentionally, yes. Yeah. No, not by him. So, these are the sacrifices that come sometimes. And I hope you'll take a time to look on the website again for the topplingGoliath.org. You can see what Johannes here recommends as his prescription for collective action, what makes that successful, what the possibilities are. But I also wanted to share with you some of the other pieces that have spun out of this. This is Kuhn, and Kuhn's an amazing guy. He first worked for Swiss Air and then for Hertz, got very interested in this whole pesticide-free future, and has been really critical in advancing the topic forward in the town. But what Kuhn did was he said, we're basically toxifying our children. Everything that we're doing here, we're spraying right beside playgrounds and schoolyards. And so he and another person got together, developed a protocol for how to go out and test residue on the in the grasses on the playgrounds and schoolyards throughout the South Tyrol, because the government wasn't doing that, the provincial government wasn't doing it. So they took these samples. They actually found that pesticide residues were there. They were very heavy in some particular cases. Brought this to the attention of the provincial government by way of a big press release, released this report. It ended up getting such traction that several scientists came in and decided that they would help them with the study. And it just appeared in the European Journal of Toxicology as a peer-reviewed article. And now they're actually stepping it up and working on another study looking at the impact of pesticides on children here. And the point there that I think is so important is that citizen-based science really matters. There are times when our governments simply aren't going to do the job that they need, whether it be municipal, state, federal, or international, and we have to do it ourselves. And science is not beyond us. And there are scientists who are there to be collaborators and to help us out in this regard. Other things started to happen. There's almost this varsity challenge of which towns can be pesticide-free throughout Europe now. And so you can actually see that there are these different places that are popping up as different towns try in different ways to be pesticide-free. And Maltz has just been, really, I would say, the primary beacon out there. So unwittingly, these people who just started a movement, within their town really became sort of these international celebrities overnight. Well, not overnight, through a lot of hard work. And this was rather astounding. I thought, what I'll show you here, we ended up being invited to the EU in Brussels to tell the story of Maltz, which I just thought, that's extraordinary, to have a government of that size paying attention. And then as we were getting ready to walk into the room to see this go across the board, to actually have the EU talking about non-pesticide cities, and to see this being promulgated is just extraordinary and gives us a sense, I think, of what the possibilities are here in the U.S. So we took the pop-up show, these images I've shown you, we took them to the EU, put them around for the social hour that we had there, and it was just amazing to see what was happening throughout Europe, but also to see what was being stirred by this group of ordinary citizens. France, in the meantime, has been working to ban glyphosate, as you've seen, perhaps in the media. So that started to pick up steam, and I'll just show you some of the different headlines that have been popping out since then. This was awesome. Back this past August, there were 150 mayors that ended up standing up against glyphosate use in their towns and requiring larger buffers, still too small, but larger buffers between places where glyphosate was used and particularly places where children and pedestrians would pass. So that's happening. This was the New York Times. Switzerland will have before it a referendum to have a transition away from all synthetic pesticides over a 10-year period. We'll see where that goes. Friends in Switzerland say they got it on the ballot in Switzerland, which took I believe it was 1 million signatures they needed. They got that. They're not sure it's going to pass, but it's there. The momentum is gaining. And then we see other news that's been coming out that I'm sure some of you have been following in looking at neonicotinoids and the environmental impact, the pollinator impact, as these things we're starting to realize what's going on. So again, France has been trying to lead the way. At least some players in France have been trying to advance that. And then there again, citizen science. There was a group of Germans working in one particular township. They've been documenting insect populations for over 30 years. I mean, that sounds kind of nerdy. Why would you do that? But I'm glad there was somebody doing it, because now they're seeing what's happening in terms of the decline. And those citizen scientists really sort of created the studies that have been the bellwether for us realizing that we're up against what some people are calling an insectageddon. This sixth species extinction is what some folks are calling it. But we're seeing a decline of 30, 40, 50% of insects in different places. And then as a result, as insect populations go down, it goes down the chain. Bird populations start to also decline. And part of this is it's about leverage points. What do people care about? How do we talk to them? If they don't care about their food, do they care about the birds? Do they care about the kids and the schoolyards? What is it? I mean, I think we can usually find somewhere where people actually have a point of caring. And so it's important to figure out where that might be. And this really is about that mass extinction that we're thinking may be underway. You think about the windshield as you travel down the road, and the fact, there aren't the bugs on the windshield that there used to be. This just came out 3 or 4 days ago, I believe. Mayfly numbers dropped by half since 2012. Since 2012, the mayfly populations are so big. The way they've documented it is by virtue of the radar recordings that they have, in the upper Midwest. Because the mayflies, the numbers have been so big, they've been picked up on radar over time, and they've actually had to kind of weed that out, if you will, in terms of their understanding of what was going on weather-wise, and we're starting to see that decline happen there. And so, as we're, part of, I think, the beauty of this and kind of what is all happening. This is a photo at Vandana Shiva's farm and educational center. This is Navdanya, and you'll see just kind of on the left side, Andre Liu, who's speaking here coming up. There were various ones among us who gathered together with Vandana Shiva to talk about her goal of a pesticide-free future for 2030. And I think the beauty of what Vandana has put forward in asking for us to have this poison-free farming by 2030 is the notion that we have to gather the communities around the world in order to do this. And in doing that, she has put forward this pledge. I hope you'll go online to sign it. It's this poison-free pledge by 2030. And the beauty of that is, I think for too long we put the weight of organic on the shoulders of the farmers. It really should be upon all of us as citizens, as consumers, and as communities. And there's the power in all of this. And the power we have to change is no longer on the single shoulders of farmers, but really on the communities themselves. So thank you so much.